Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Gyo Kim. The United States has been clear for long it is open to providing humanitarian support to North Korea, regardless of progress on the latter's denuclearization. And North Korea has recently dismissed the U.S. humanitarian offer, calling it a sinister political scheme. Meanwhile, North Korea claimed it has beaten the COVID-19 outbreak, although its claims are being met with widespread doubt. Today, we'll discuss these and more.
But I doubt they have their hands on hard currency that will allow them to purchase a large amount of fertilizer, even though they really need it.
From senior U.S. officials to senior DPRK officials, included specific proposals, including regarding humanitarian cooperation and COVID-19 related assistance.
In the studio with me is Keith Luse. Mr. Luse is Executive Director of the National Committee on North Korea. Previously, Mr. Luse was the Senior East Asia Policy Advisor for late Senator Richard Lugar at the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee for 10 years. Troy Stangarone is also with me today. Mr. Stangarone is Senior Director and Fellow at the Korea Economic Institute. Prior to joining KEI, he worked on Capitol Hill, advising on issues relating to foreign affairs and trade. Welcome to the program. Good to have you both today.
Good to be here.
So before we start with the topic we plan to do, we want to talk about the shocking news coming out of Japan. Former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was shot to death earlier. And he left a lot of legacies in terms of his economic policies and foreign policies. And especially, he also did a lot of things involved in the North Korean issues. And I was wondering if you could share, both of you, share about your thoughts on what Mr. Abe did while he was alive. At first, Mr. Luse, I understand you have met Mr. Abe?
Yes, and first I would like to convey my condolences to the people of Japan, to Mr. Abe's family, to his friends regarding this tragedy, horrific tragedy. Mr. Abe had a track record focusing on North Korea through his professional life. I think he is, at least in the United States, often known and recalled in terms of his work on the abductee issue. Whenever he would visit Washington, visit Capitol Hill, the abductees were always at the top of his list, and he continually encouraged U.S. administrations and the Congress to focus on abductees in any engagement with North Korea. On one occasion, my colleague Frank Januzzi and I, while we were at the Foreign Relations Committee, had been to North Korea in 2003, and the North Koreans, that particular visit, were more talkative than usual on the abductee topic. And so we decided, Frank and I, to stop in Tokyo en route back to the United States. Mr. Abe, who was then Chief Cabinet Secretary, met with us at length. It was clear that he was quite involved and aware of the issue. Having said that, I think later in his professional life, he maybe took a harder line regarding North Korea. There may have been some disappointment on his part that he was unable to come to terms with the North on the abductee issue.
Mm-hmm. Would you say Mr. Abe's stance on North Korea has affected the stance that his followers took?
Well, I think that, first of all, Mr. Abe was responding to his constituents, many of whom had not been heard or listened to by previous leaders in Japan on the abductee issue. Mm-hmm. And so he responded to that, and he kept the issue alive, much to the happiness of especially families of the abductees.
Mr. Stangarone?
Well, I'd also like to send my condolences to the people of Japan, former Prime Minister Abe's family, and others. I think, when we look back at Abe's legacy, and specifically North Korea, the abductee issue is going to be, as Keith mentioned, the key part of this. But, if we look a little deeper, it was during the time of Prime Minister Koizumi, but we did see progress at that time. There were some who returned. North Korea admitted to having abducted some Japanese citizens. It was never something that was adequately finalized, and there are still issues that Prime Minister Abe later in life tried to take and resolve and was able to come to a resolution with North Korea. But I think we should look at that for the families who he was able to give some kind of resolution to. There is real progress in his legacy on this issue with North Korea.
Yeah, for now, North Korea is claiming that they have resolved the abductee issue with Japan. Their stance, will it ever change?
I would hope at some point in the future when the leadership realizes that it's important to repair relations with other countries in the region. I don't know that will come anytime soon, but there are enough unanswered questions for this to not be a closed issue. And it's something that, the families in Japan deserve an answer to.
Mr. Luse, could you share your thought on how North Korea is taking this abductee issue?
Well, I believe that, as you stated, it is unresolved. And yet I'm very careful to make comments or predictions based upon whatever may have happened in the past or might continue to happen behind the scenes between Japan and North Korea.
So now we'll move on to the topic. The United States has been clearly sending signals to North Korea that it is open to humanitarian assistance for North Korea. And Sung Kim, U.S. Special Representative for North Korea and U.S. Deputy Ambassador to UN, Jeffrey DeLaurentis, publicly said the U.S. sent those messages to North Korea directly and indirectly. Mr. Luse, why do you think these two high-ranking U.S. officials made it public that U.S. has made such offers to North Korea?
Well, I think that Ambassador Kim and others are simply being transparent in conveying the openness of the United States, the willingness of the U.S. To connect, to meet with the North Koreans at some level. Having said that, I also understand perhaps the reticence of the North Koreans to respond. Kim Jong-un met with the President of the United States multiple times. He was never able to deliver sanctions relief back to Pyongyang. And so for any suggestion by the United States to meet or to connect with the North Koreans, I would imagine the North may want some more details. What does that mean? Because, again, there were multiple meetings in the past, multiple interactions, and sanctions relief did not occur, which the North Koreans desperately want. Having said that, however, I should also note that the North Koreans were unwilling during the Trump years. They were often unwilling in terms of the Singapore experience, Hanoi, to meet at length with Steve Biegun, our Deputy Secretary of State, and prior to that, Special Representative for North Korea. So there's a lot to this in terms of the details that contribute to the successful negotiation.
North Korea is saying the U.S. talking about humanitarian assistance is only a political ploy. Why do you think North Korea said that?
Even if we go back to the Trump administration, they had made clear during the pandemic that they were willing to help North Korea through this situation. I can understand both the skepticism on the North Korean side and also, to be honest, politically seeking help from the United States probably isn't very popular within this regime in North Korea. And so that's why I do think whatever we do, it probably does need to be through COVAX, other UN organizations and whatnot. So that way we can get North Korea the help they need, but they don't have to take and worry about the politics internally with the United States.
All right. Mr. Luse, this statement from North Korea, does it show North Korea's frustration or skepticism, as they said, towards the engagement with the United States?
I suspect there are multiple factors that contribute to North Korea's statement on the issue of humanitarian assistance. After the Hanoi summit, North Korea, in essence, stopped talking to the United States. No track one, government-to-government engagement. The North Koreans were unwilling to continue engaging in track twos. North Koreans also, after Hanoi, have been unwilling to accept COVID-related assistance from U.S. humanitarian NGOs. So this is not, the statement is recent, but their position has been longer term. And I believe that there are other factors that enter into their thinking as for their domestic audience as well. That's one of the areas.
There has been some speculation that North Korea might do 7th nuclear test soon, but there's also assessment that North Korea is not likely to do so because of the heavy rains. Do you agree with that assessment?
When it comes to North Korea, nothing would surprise me. All right. So indeed, the weather is probably a factor in terms of the timing of another test, but there may be other realities that enter into that as well. I have no idea, for example, the role China has played perhaps behind the scenes in discouraging the North from moving ahead with another test. I suspect at some point they will proceed, regardless of China, regardless of what we may think, because the North, they're wanting, they need to perfect their systems, whether it relates to ICBM capabilities or otherwise. And so I believe it's inevitable that testing will continue.
Mr. Stangarone, what's your view on this possible 7th nuclear test?
I agree with Keith. I think it's very challenging to figure out when the North Koreans will do a test. But we should keep in mind, as Keith mentioned, they're doing these tests because they would like to take and develop multiple capabilities. They want to be able to take and miniaturize their devices. They want to be able to take and have SLBMs. They were looking to try and develop other ways to take, in essence, have a capability that cannot be wiped out in an initial strike if a war were to break out. And so North Korea will probably test at some point in the future when it feels it has the technical advances it needs to run the test, and that will probably be the major driving factor. We often talk about North Korea testing to get our attention and other things, but ultimately they do these tests for the technological advancements, and we should be more cognizant that if we look at the broader politics right now, it's hard to see why the North Koreans would want to engage with the United States and why they would feel the need to get our attention, because we've been continuously saying we're willing to talk to them. And so they have our attention. They have just been unwilling. So I think we need to focus on the technical advances they're trying to make rather than whether this is some type of signal to the United States for talks or not.
And if we go back to the flooding situation in North Korea, and now North Korea seems to be struck by severe flooding as well. Its state media is broadcasting flood warnings continuously.
In a broader sense, part of this is North Korea's own internal challenges. We have a situation to where you have a population that is food deficient, that has taken to moving and cutting trees and other things down to try and gain food, gain more farming land. That has taken and eroded the soil, which has made flooding more likely because there's less areas for the water to go and to be absorbed. And so part of this is a result of North Korea's underinvestment in its own agriculture and its own topography over the years.
Mr. Luse, what is the way to fix the North Korea's continuous this flooding situation? It's happening every year, right?
Well, the North Koreans have been implementing strategies that they've been developing to try to combat flooding through infrastructure, better infrastructure, et cetera. Having said that, they're also impacted by sanctions to some degree. On one of my trips to the north, where I witnessed an extreme flooding situation, it was clear that the dams continued to break. They needed bulldozers. They needed other equipment that at the time was prevented by sanctions. So I think sanctions is a factor. However, it is not the dominant factor in the flooding situation. But I think the North Koreans are making progress on the flooding front, at least over the last 2 to 3 years.
Then what is the dominant factor affecting those flooding infrastructure lacking?
In what sense?
Because you said sanctions are not the dominant factor?
Well, I think part of it is, which is actually a combination of things. It depends upon the part of the country. For example, there's a serious issue of deforestation in the north, right? There are challenges related to erosion. And so this isn't just a matter of getting more equipment in to build dams, it's also a matter of putting into place certain techniques that would help prevent erosion which they have been doing, but I think they are doing now on a more systematic basis.
Do you see any change in North Korea's or Kim Jong-un's? So do you see some improvements on how he's trying to deal with this issue?
There are reports that the situation has improved. However, I cannot personally attest to that.
All right. Mr. Stangarone, do you have any comments to add to that?
The one thing I would just add is if we look in the UN organizations, North Korea has engaged on climate change. And one thing that you can do to try and mitigate climate change and also take and mitigate the damage from changes in the climate is to do reforestation. Now, North Korea has at least put signals that they are doing this, but there are ways to perhaps work with the North Koreans to try and expedite this process and improve it. And so I think if we look at this in terms of cooperating with North Korea on climate change, at the last, at COP26, they agreed on a formula for how you would take and compensate people who maintain forests. So perhaps there's some way to take and work with the North Koreans to reforest North Korea, then provide them compensation for maintaining those forests, and that would then help improve some of these situations with flooding and other things. So there's a way perhaps to work with this if we put it in a different type of context.
So we talked about COVID situation and flooding situation and food shortages in North Korea. And the US government has always maintained that North Korean regime is wholly responsible for causing humanitarian crisis within the country, as the regime is exploiting the people and diverting resources. Mr. Stangarone, do you agree with this view?
I think the regime is largely responsible. They have dedicated resources to the weapons programs. But if we look at the food situation, it's complex. If we look at the trade data over recent years, you do see points to where North Korea is importing things like fertilizer for agriculture, where they are taking and importing grains. But we also see things that don't make sense. If we look back during the pandemic, North Korea did import fertilizer, but it didn't import any wheat or barley or anything or rice until recently. And so Kim Jong-un last year was talking about, they have this food crisis in North Korea, but they're not importing, grains from China. And so this doesn't quite match up on why they're not doing that. And so, any situation is complex, and so there are things that are probably beyond even the North Koreans' control, but there are clear times to where they could be dedicating more efforts to importing the types of things they need to take and deal with the situation. And Keith mentioned that they haven't talked to us essentially since Hanoi. The Russians and the Chinese have been looking to try and do some kind of partial sanctions relief. If the North Koreans tried to negotiate a smaller initial deal with the United States, that might give them some relief to help bring in some of the things they need, and also take and start the process. That's something else they can do, but we haven't really seen any willingness on their part to engage.
Mr. Luse, what's your thought on the U.S. government's stance on, North Korea regime is wholly responsible for the humanitarian crisis?
Well, first I'd like for a moment to go back to sanctions in the sense that while there's a lively debate as to the effectiveness of sanctions against North Korea, sanctions is not presently responsible for the closing of the border, the disruption of supply chains, the fact that medicine has not been going in, food has not been going in, fertilizer and other inputs have not been going in significant amounts. This is a North Korea situation where decisions have been made by North Korea to shut out these inputs, which do affect life in terms of not just agriculture, people staying alive, et cetera, et cetera. So this is very important that we factor this in. Having said that, the North Koreans also, there's this continual discussion about life for the elites versus the rest of the country. I am not in a position to make any statements about what is or is not occurring in the countryside, but I'm concerned by the fact that typically in the over the long term, the folks in the countryside do not have the same access, typically have not had some of the same benefits. My first trip to North Korea in 2002 related to the fact that the World Food Program was unable to access certain areas of the North. And I think those challenges still continue. So what I don't know is the commitment of the North Korean leaders to providing assistance to the country as a whole, as opposed to simply Pyongyang, the elites, et cetera.
So, yeah, there have been a lot of debate over whether if humanitarian aid goods go into the country, whether that will reach the people in the rural areas. And is there any way to make sure it happens? Are you skeptical about it? Are you worried about it?
Well, I'm hopeful that long term, the North Korean leadership will allow the essential monitoring of international assistance going in. When I say essential monitoring, whether it be the United States government, whether it be other governments, whether it be international NGOs, people want to know that what they're donating, what they're getting into the country actually gets to those in need. And so I think, North Korea in the past, 2008, 2009 time frame, there was this consortium, this NGO consortium led by Mercy Corps and a number of other US NGOs, World Vision, working with the North Koreans, and the North Koreans did allow access. The North Koreans allowed, to a degree, they did allow monitoring. But then one day the North Korean says, that's enough, it's over. So monitoring is essential, because if monitoring's not there, there's a lack of confidence on the part of donors, on the part of governments to be helpful. But this is where we get into the situation of the complexity within North Korea. Mm-hmm. Too often we consider North Korea as this monolith, when in fact you have these various factions, these ministries, these stovepipes, and they don't always agree with each other. You have some in North Korea whom I believe are very open to monitoring, mm-hmm. would welcome this. They want the assistance to get in. You have others who emphasize security to the point of not allowing anyone in it. You know, when the UN officials left the country, as foreign embassy personnel have departed the country, they've not been allowed to send other people back in. Mm. And this goes, so the closure of the border goes beyond sound science. Mm. It's a matter of control. It's a matter of national security in the minds of some of those in leadership. So this, again, I want to emphasize the complexities of the decision-making process and the struggle in terms of who allows what related to the border and otherwise.
Mm-hmm. So our time is almost up, so I'm going to ask both of you a last question. Then, is it North Korea should show some initiative in terms of accepting those humanitarian aid or engagement with the outside world? Or other countries, US, South Korea, should do more? What's your thought?
Well, the ball is in North Korea's court. Mm-hmm. South Korea, the United States, so many countries have offered to be of help. But I'm of the personal opinion that North Korea will move ahead, will allow international assistance into the country. I believe that it's entirely possible North Korea will allow necessary levels of monitoring. The question is, however, when will this occur?
Mm-hmm. Mr. Stangarone.
Yeah, I think the one thing I would say is to build on Keith's comment about the border and it being a tool of control rather than sound science is that, you know, we want to get past the point to where we need to provide North Korea with aid, and to do that we need more rational border processes, so that way the trade that was going on before the pandemic, which brought food in, which provided food and consumer goods into the markets, can resume, and so that way the population can use the markets within the country to get the necessities they need, rather than the international community having to provide aid.
Recent UN reports showed more than 40% of North Koreans are undernourished amid concerns of food security in the impoverished country. Experts say fundamental measure for North Korea is to get into a relationship with other countries where they could get help from. But simply, the North Korean regime hasn't been willing to do so. Mr. Luse and Mr. Stangarone, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.